Hello and welcome to the Ask Dr. Pickel show, where we try to find answers and help for people who have chronic conditions, chronic health issues. And today, very exciting topic. I have a lot of patients who have issues that relate to this, and which of course they don't come to me saying, hey, why do I have a problem with this neurotransmitter? They'll say, hey, why do I have a problem with these types of symptoms? So we're going to kind of put some of this together, and I think you'll like it. And the issue that we'll talk about today is dopamine, and what kind of problems you can have if dopamine is not correct in your system. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. What does that mean? It's part of our brain chemistry. Not only our brain chemistry, but dopamine is also used below the brain and in other parts of the body too, and we need it. It's pretty darn important for a lot of things. And when we talk about brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, this is how nerve cells, this is how certain cells in our body communicate with each other, is these neurotransmitters. They say, hey, do this. Here's the messenger here. Here's the chemical. So cause this to happen. So we need these neurotransmitters. We need them to deliver the correct message and to deliver it properly. And so if that doesn't work, yeah, we can get a lot of health problems. So when we talk about dopamine itself, we got to go over a few things. Let's first, we're going to talk about kind of where dopamine is made in the body, in the brain, and what it's about, what it's used for, what symptoms relate to. In fact, we'll talk about the symptoms first, and then problems that can cause issues with dopamine. So let's dive right into that and start doing a little drawing here. All right, so dopamine is made in a few different areas. The first thing we want to look at is the, see if I can draw here, the brain, and then we have the brainstem and the spinal cord. So we got the brain up here, and then we've got the brainstem here, and then of course spinal cord here. So the brainstem is kind of divided into three different sections, but this top section up here, that's what we're going to talk about the most, and it's called the midbrain, or another word for that is mesencephalon. All right, you don't have to remember that. But the thing is this, there's some areas in here, very important areas in this upper brainstem where the majority of dopamine is made. And we'll get into that a little bit further, but in particular, this is an extremely important area. So what I want to do is I want to shift, and let's get rid of that. And let's first, now that you kind of just say, hey, here's the brain, that's where a lot of the dopamine's made. What can happen if we're not making enough dopamine? Well, one thing you've probably heard of a lot when a person has low dopamine is Parkinson's disease. So when you have Parkinson's disease, yeah, this is a dopamine issue, a low dopamine issue. The brain isn't producing enough dopamine. What's another dopamine issue that we commonly hear about? ADHD, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In fact, there's a whole category now of things related to ADD, ADHD, things like that. So we won't get into those details. And then another big one you see with dopamine is depression. And when we say depression, there's not just one type of depression. There's different types of depression, different descriptions. If you ask 3 or 4 different people, what do you feel when you feel depressed? They may all give you different answers. So dopamine has more specific types of depression related to that we'll get to, certain symptoms that go with that. And then another one that's commonly related to dopamine, restless leg syndrome, where a person goes to bed, maybe they lay down to go to sleep, and gosh, I can't get that leg to calm down. And restless leg syndrome, not a good thing. And another thing is ticks. Not ticks like the bug ticks, but ticks like facial ticks, body ticks where a muscle twitches, or a tick could be like my mouth moves a certain way, or my eyes twitch, or there's a lot of different types of ticks, usually involving musculoskeletal movements anywhere in the body. There's another condition called dystonia. I'm not going to get into the details of that now, but you can always look that up and find out more about dystonia, because it can really cause a lot of problems. It can be very severe too, and really affect people's health. Sometimes when you see dystonia, you'll a lot of times see it in the neck and upper back, where maybe a person has like a head, or maybe a condition called torticollis. Maybe you've heard of that. So dystonia. But there's a bunch of other types of dystonia also, but this again relates to dopamine. And then another thing that relates is addiction. So when people are addicted to smoking or drugs or alcohol or gambling or different things, this is a dopamine issue many times. And then another condition in the research you'll see closely related to dopamine is schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder. So again, very interesting how this is related. So what can be the symptoms of lower dopamine in a person? And I want to kind of write those out. Probably the biggest one I'll see is when people say, I feel hopeless. There's just no hope at all in life. Hope is gone. Yeah, that's dopamine. And that's the kind of depression that goes with dopamine a lot of times. I mean, there's some other things that will tie into that too, but especially that hopeless feeling. And another one that goes into that is low motivation. If you're like, hey, I wish I could just sit in this chair all day and do anything, I really don't feel drive or motivated to really do anything, no ambition, low dopamine. It drives the frontal lobes of the brain to help give you that motivation that you need. Another thing that occurs when dopamine drops off is snap easily or irritable. If you feel like you are irritable, like, just any little thing affects you, or if you're around someone and they just kind of go off on you for barely saying anything or barely causing, just for almost no reason at all, low dopamine. So yeah, this can definitely occur. And another thing that occurs with low dopamine is can't handle stress. So if you're a person that it's like any little amount of stress just totally knocks you out, where you're like, gosh, I had this little bit of stress today, the rest of your day is just ruined. That's low dopamine. We should be able to handle a certain amount of stress. Another thing that dopamine does to help our frontal lobes is it helps with organization. So you will become disorganized. All right. Also, can't finish tasks. If you start something and you can never finish it and you just move on to the next thing, yeah, that's dopamine. Another thing would be you kind of are apathetic, apathy. You don't care. It's like things happen around you, things happen in your life or to others, and you could really care less. You just kind of, it doesn't even faze you, which isn't good. And then another thing we'll see commonly with low dopamine is isolation from others. So when dopamine drops low, this will cause you to be like, hey, everybody just leave me alone. I need to be by myself, or, you really don't want to be social with anybody. You lose that this social ability, which of course also is not good. So these are a lot of the things that go along with dopamine. So when a person has these types of symptoms, and I would say that a lot of people that I have as patients that have these types of issues, the depression side of, hey, I feel, and we can put actually just depression on this side too. But they'll say, hey, I feel kind of hopeless. I feel irritable all the time. I feel like if people make me mad, I just want to strangle them. I feel like if a little stress comes on, it really affects me in a major way, and then just everybody leave me alone because I want to just be by myself. So again, these are very common symptoms. So let's go back to what can affect this. Why would you have these issues? Is it just that you need an antidepressant? Because usually if you go into your conventional doctor, they're going to say, hey, you're feeling depressed all the time. You're feeling hopeless, this and that. Here's your medication. Here's your dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Or if there's another side of another side of dopamine that affects Parkinson's, there's even medication for that too. So we'll get into some of these things and how it relates together, because our goal is not really to just treat the symptom. You can't give a person, you can't just say, hey, take dopamine. It doesn't work. It doesn't go through the blood-brain barrier. So there's a certain route to this and a certain way to this. So you can't just treat the symptoms. If a person has these types of symptoms, if a person has these types of symptoms, we got to say, what's causing this? Why are you having this? What's the mechanism here? What's really going on to lead to this? So let's talk about that. All right, let's go back to this. Okay, so first of all, we talked about in the brain where that dopamine's made. So let's kind of on a smaller scale draw that brain again, and we've got the upper brainstem, and then so we got the brainstem here, 3 parts, and then we got the spinal cord. All right, so in this upper part, this part called the mesencephalon, the midbrain, there's a couple areas in there. I'm going to get a little technical on you for all of you people who like the technical side and the fancy words. All right, so it's called the substantia nigra. And that's one place this dopamine's made, in this upper brainstem. And then the other place that it's made is called the ventral tegmentum. And not that you have to remember these, but this is just going to kind of help to draw some things out. Because the thing is these two produce dopamine, and then dopamine has to kind of get on a train to go to the rest of the body. It gets on a pathway. And there's multiple pathways, and these pathways do different things. So one of these pathways is called the mesocortical. All right, and this mesocortical, this more goes into cognition, motivation, and this would also be personality. So if this area is not working right, what's going to happen? Yeah, my focus, my concentration, my ADD, ADHD symptoms are worsened. My motivation's low. My personality is really kind of flat. There's not much there. I can't communicate with people. It's like a person that gets in a group of people and they're just quiet and they can't really say anything. They can't think of anything to say. They just don't, there's no social skills really there is good, or it can really cause those types of symptoms that decrease the apathy and decrease sociability. Now there's another part here too called meso. Meso means middle in Latin. Meso, and that middle as in the brainstem. Remember, this is in the area of the brainstem called the mesencephalon, this upper area of the brainstem. It's in kind of in the midline of the brain. So mesolimbic. And limbic, this is the emotional side of the brain, the deep emotional side. Sometimes in the science, they'll call it the animalistic side that we've got to control. So again, we need this working properly, but that operates more, like I said, on emotion and reward. So if you do something and someone says you did a fantastic job and gives you a prize or a gift or something like that, that lights up your brain and you get extra dopamine and your brain goes, hooray, this is what I like, give me rewards, and that can motivate me. So again, we want this area working properly. It can give us these emotions that we need to get from dopamine. If it gets low, yeah, this is a problem. And this is also what we'll see where, let's say you eat some chocolate. Chocolate basically has a chemical in it that's kind of it's like a natural amphetamine. I know that sounds horrible, but that actually stimulates dopamine production. So again, that lights up this area. And it's like, whoa, I love that chocolate. All right. Then we get nigrostriatal. All right, and this area has to do more with movement of like arms, limbs, leg, just any body movement. We need dopamine to stimulate the area of our brain that triggers movement. What happens if we get less dopamine? Well, things in the body slow down. One tract that's affected most commonly affects Parkinson's. What happens in Parkinson's disease? You get a resting tremor. So this means that, let's say I put my hand down on a table or a chair or a chair arm, and it starts to shake. Now, when I move it, it stops shaking again. But when I rest it, it starts to shake, a resting tremor. So this is the body slowing down. The brain is sending less signals. Actually, our whole body vibrates at a certain speed. It vibrates at a speed that's fast enough that we can't see it. If I just look at my hand normally, it should be steady and calm. But if we slow that down, we start to see the vibration, we start to see the tremor. Now, there's another side to that too. Some people produce too much dopamine that affects a certain area of the brain, and then they can get movement disorders where all of a sudden their arm just flies out or their body jerks completely. These are these other motion disorders that we don't want. So movement, very, very, very important. Here's another one, Infundibular. All these crazy words. All right, so Infundibular, this does a few things. Now, number one, it goes mainly, the thing to remember is it goes to the hypothalamus. I wrote HT there for hypothalamus. This area of the brain, very important. It regulates all of our hormones in our body, especially thyroid hormones, female hormones, adrenal hormones. There's all these loops where it communicates with the hypothalamus. It also ties into emotions, body temperature, appetite. Hypothalamus is pretty important. But where it relates into the hypothalamus with dopamine is in a couple of things. One of the loops there that affects it is called the arcuate. Gosh, I missed my letter here. Let me. Okay. Oh, wait. Sorry, that's okay. Arcuate. Okay. So this arcuate loop relates mainly to prolactin, and maybe you've heard of prolactin. So when a woman's has a baby, prolactin is released. Basically, the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland release prolactin. And what happens when you release prolactin? You get milk released from the breast. You get what's called letdown of milk. So, which is important. So the thing is, though, is if dopamine isn't working properly, what happens? We can have prolactin issues. Usually this will be that, hey, I stopped breastfeeding, but I'm still getting breast milk production, even a year later. Yeah, this can be a problem, and it can be related to dopamine. Another area that's affected is, I'm going to just write PVN here. It's called the periventricular nucleus. You don't have to remember that. The thing to remember with this is where you make TRH. What is TRH? Thyroid releasing hormone. So wait a second. My emotions, my neurotransmitters, dopamine affects my thyroid? Wow, absolutely. Because what does TRH do? It stimulates TSH, and that's the one you get on your blood test that the doctor says, hey, your TSH is high or low. So if you have low dopamine, that can cause a hypothyroid issue. Kind of interesting there. It also could cause a TSH issue where the doctor might even say, hey, your TSH is low. We're going to drop your medication, your dosage down. And you're like, don't do that. And then they do it. And then you get all your low thyroid symptoms back. But the problem wasn't that you were on too much hormone. It was that your dopamine level was low and affecting your TSH. I mean, again, we won't go into that. That's a totally different book there. But kind of interesting how that works. Now, this is all brain sources of dopamine. Now, there's actually a couple others here. There's one called the zona incerta. And this is where you make GRH. Now, GRH, G stands for gonadal. And so this is the hormone that stimulates the testes or the ovaries to make hormones. So again, low dopamine, that can affect your hormone levels. So yeah, this is pretty important stuff. And then, so gonadal releasing hormone, if I didn't say that. And then another interesting area that's affected, or that dopamine is produced in, is the retina. Yeah, the retina of the eye. What the heck is going on there? So what happens when people have low dopamine? They will notice decreased colors or contrasts. So life's less exciting. You know, visually, everything's a little grayer. And that's why sometimes what will happen is I'll have patients that we get their dopamine level up and they're like, hey, everything looks a little brighter, colors are better, you know, it's more exciting. Yeah, this is dopamine and makes life better. Now, here's the thing too, is dopamine isn't just produced in the brain in all these areas, it's also produced in the body. So if we go to the body, we're going to see a couple areas here mainly. One of them is your adrenal glands, mainly called the adrenal medulla. That's kind of the very center of the adrenal glands. And that adrenal medulla does a few things, but mainly it affects your blood pressure, heart, ties into your immune system. And it'll also tie in, especially into your sympathetic nervous system. This is where you make what are called catecholamines. This is where epinephrine, norepinephrine, the things that kind of your adrenaline basically produced here. So we need that. In fact, dopamine is a catecholamine. It's kind of along the same lines as adrenaline. Very interesting stuff. And then when it's produced at this level. And then also the kidneys. The kidneys produce some dopamine to help with what you would call renal hemodynamics. What does that mean? It helps your kidneys to kind of adjust your levels of sodium, potassium, excrete certain amounts of electrolytes to keep that stability. Those adrenals and those kidneys, very important in keeping your electrolytes balanced. Sodium, potassium, chloride, all these things. All right. So very interesting. So now we kind of know where dopamine's manufactured. So if there's a fault, if we don't have enough dopamine, how can this happen? We've got these areas of the body that make it, the areas of the brain that make it. What's the problem? Why aren't they making enough? Why can't they do their job? Well, in order to make dopamine, they have certain requirements. And that's what I want to go over next, because therein lies the solution. If we can find out what it takes to make dopamine, what it takes to help these areas of the body and the brain make dopamine, then we can potentially find out what's not working. Where's the wrench been thrown into the gear that's creating a problem potentially with you and your ability to make dopamine and of course cause you to have these symptoms. So next, let's talk about kind of how this occurs. Okay, so first, remember, we have the brain and we have the body. And what separates the brain from the body? Interesting question. The blood-brain barrier. I'm just going to write BBB, blood-brain barrier. There's a barrier here that separates the body from the brain. We don't want stuff in our body getting up into our brain. So there's this wall there, and it's part of our immune system. It's pretty darn important. So certain things can cross, though. There are certain acceptable things that can go through the firewall. Let's put it that way. All right. So we've got this, and let's go down to the body side first, because this is where it really all starts. First of all, one of the biggest things that we have to have in order to make dopamine is protein. Protein. So you get protein from meats, veggies. We got to have it. So we eat our protein, and then it has to go to our stomach. I'm going to just put gut for intestines, because we got to digest it and we got to absorb it. If we can't do that, there's a problem. So we're gonna come back to that in just a second, because we'll go through all the potential problems, but that's kind of one of the pathways it has to go through. So next, after you digest your protein, it turns into amino acids. And these amino acids do all kinds of things. And the particular amino acid we need for dopamine is called phenylalanine. Okay, so phenylalanine, an essential amino acid. We need this. And really, dietary sources, there's not a lot, really. It's not something that, you can find. I mean, it's in, of course, protein, but it's just not something that's always easily gotten in. So the thing is once we get this phenylalanine, so now we got the amino acid, it's going into our blood, and then where does it go next on this pathway? It goes to the liver. So it gets to the liver, and then the liver actually uses an enzyme. Let's use our arrow here, and we'll use another arrow right here. And there's an enzyme in the liver. It's I'll just write PAH. You don't really need to know that. It's phenylalanine hydroxylase. And what that does is it takes that phenylalanine and it chops it up and turns it into another amino acid that's made from phenylalanine. And what is that called? That is called N-acetyl L-tyrosine. You may have heard of tyrosine. So this is another amino acid that we need. Now it's in this N-acetyl L form, and there's a reason for that, which we're going to get to here. But definitely the next thing that has to occur is this N-acetyl L-tyrosine has to be in this form, because this allows it to pass through the blood-brain barrier. But it can only do that if it's bound to, let's say, a taxi cab. There's a taxi cab that it goes with called LNAA. And this is another amino acid, basically. It's a neutral amino acid. Another reason why amino acids are so important. So this LNAA, this is like a taxi cab that carries it, allows it to pass through the blood-brain barrier. So now we've passed through the blood-brain barrier, and we are now, one second here. Somebody said there's been an error here in our broadcast. Okay, I think everything's all right. Okay. All right, sorry about that break there. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Okay, so we go into past the blood-brain barrier, and now we can actually turn this type of tyrosine into THB, Tetrahydrobiopterin. I know it sounds like we're in some science course here. I'm not trying to make it that way. There's a reason behind all this. This Tetrahydrobiopterin, pretty important. And let's just kind of go quickly here. This one gets turned into another thing. Basically, you may have heard of this. It's called DOPA, which DOPA is basically what we call it's phenylalanine. It's a certain type. So again, now where do you hear about DOPA? You hear about it more with they might give it to Parkinson's patients. But again, our brain doesn't use it in this form. It still has to go and turn into something else, which again, it goes through another set of amino acids. Basically, this is a aromatic amino acid decarboxylase, another enzyme that turns this DOPA into dopamine. And there's a couple of things that affect this too. Now that we have this, what happens to this dopamine? Does it just float around in space and think it knows how to do its thing? No, it actually has to do something. It doesn't really know what to do on its own. Now it has to follow along these pathways we talked about and go to your cells. And on your cells, there are doorways. We're going to call them receptors. And the thing is these receptors have to be functioning. So again, if you can go to someone's house and knock on their door, but they may not let you in. So the thing is think of it as a doorway. There's special doorways for dopamine. They're called dopamine receptors, and we need these working properly too. And we'll talk about what affects them also. So again, once you get into the cell, once the receptor, let's say the door opens, the dopamine gets into the cell. And now what happens? I mean, hello, hi, I'm home. I'm dopamine. Yeah, now you got to go to the DNA, RNA level, and that codes for protein. So then that activates certain things, and then you get a result. You get hey, now the cells are going to produce this, and you get a response. Okay, I got the dopamine to my cell. Now I can have attention. Now I can be social. Now I can focus and concentrate. Now I don't feel hopeless. So again, this dopamine has to travel through quite a few different things to get from point A to point B. And if any of these areas has a problem, which we're going to talk about here in a second, messes up a lot of things. So in fact, let's go in red here. So let's start at the very beginning. First of all, if you're not eating enough protein, you already have a problem. So if you have a dopamine problem, you need protein. And again, you need a balanced diet. Don't just think, hey, I'm only going to eat protein. No, and also get different sources of protein too. And we can talk to you more about that because I don't want to get into dietary things as much here. But we do, as a service, we help people with their diets. But our first issue where things can occur besides diet is next, stomach and the gut. Let's say you eat plenty of protein. You eat quite a bit of protein. Well, what happens to that protein? It's got to be able to digest in your stomach. It's got to be able to absorb in your small intestine. These things are crucial. So maybe you don't make enough stomach acid. Stomach acid has been kind of criminalized in the media or in the commercials by the drug companies because, again, of the antacid drugs. Get rid of the acid. So if you're on antacid drugs, you may have a protein issue. This could be the start of your problem. You may have stomach issues where you don't digest foods. You may have gastritis where your stomach's inflamed. Again, there's usually a cause for that. But again, you're not making enough hydrochloric acid to break down not only break down the protein, but the hydrochloric acid activates the enzymes that help to break down your food further. So again, that's another thing. Do you have digestive enzyme issues? Is the gut inflamed and swollen, like a leaky gut issue? Gut inflammation where you're not absorbing those bigger molecules, those proteins, those fatty acids, those minerals. So again, big area of potential problem here. So then we go from the stomach and gut. Now, if you do make it past there with your protein, then you finally get that amino acid, this phenylalanine, and then it goes to the liver. This is our next area of potential problem. What can happen in the liver? Well, Your liver may be burdened by toxins, definitely a big potential. It may be burdened by medications. Lots of medications affect your liver negatively. It's the main exit door for medication residues, let's put it that way. Let's say you drink alcohol, which is hard on the liver. A drink a day, I feel, is going to hinder this and compromise this. Now, you put a drink a day on top of medications, you just made it worse. I won't go into that completely, but yeah, and sometimes drinking alcohol in large amounts in certain times can really hinder this. And actually, one thing to know about this is that basically, let's say you do drink a lot of alcohol and you get a hangover. What happens to this liver? This is part of the hangover. Dopamine drops. It bottoms out. Because what happens when dopamine drops? Yeah, low motivation. I just feel lousy. My life, you can get these real negative symptoms of low dopamine. So that's part of the hangover issue there. Now, there's a couple of things that go into this too. And one thing the liver has to have to process this for that PAH enzyme is vitamin B6, which again, when you drink a lot of alcohol, you burn through your B6 really quickly. So we need, especially that vitamin B6. And I always, of course, recommend the activated form of B6, P5P, to help out on that side. So now another thing that has to occur, let's say we get past the liver. If you don't have any liver issues, you don't have anything that affects your liver's in pretty good shape, then now you can convert this amino acid and it turns into this N-acetyl L-tyrosine. Now this N-acetyl L-tyrosine, in order for it to work properly, in order for this to work properly, one of the big things you have to have is good blood sugar. So if you have a blood sugar issue, if you have low blood sugar, if you have high blood sugar, low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, high blood sugar could just be insulin resistance, or which is pre-diabetes, or diabetes. And the early signs of that, a lot of people say, I don't have diabetes, I don't have a blood sugar issue. Well, do you ever get tired right after you eat a meal? Do you ever crave sweets after meals? Potentially you have a blood sugar problem. Do you get irritable if you miss meals? Do you crave sweets all the time? Do you feel shaky or get headachy if you miss meals? Yeah. Now, another example of that would be when they show those commercials. It's a candy bar commercial where people get hangry and then they eat the candy bar and they feel better again. What is that all about? Dopamine. They just increase their dopamine. They help their blood sugar out. So if you get low blood sugar, high blood sugar, if you don't get your blood sugar issue under control, you're going to affect your dopamine no matter what. And that's why people with diabetes typically are going to end up with a dopamine issue. And then they'll end up being put on maybe an antidepressant. Whereas a lot of hypoglycemics just tend to either try to eat more, or they just, tend to live that way until it turns into diabetes. So again, we've got to have good blood sugar for this step to occur. Extremely, extremely important. All right, so then we get up here to this tetrahydrobiopterin. This is another area where things can go wrong. And what can happen here? A few different things. In order for this to work, in order to get that, to make that dopa, we got to have folate. We've got to have iron. I'm just going to write Fe for iron. And I'm going to write O2 because that's oxygen. So what can affect these? What can affect folate? How do you get folate? Well, your dark green leafy vegetables. If you don't eat any vegetables at all, if you don't eat much dark green leafies, you're not getting much folate. I mean, yeah, there's going to be some other sources, but that's going to be your richest sources. So increase your veggies to help this dopamine issue out. Iron. Iron's in about everything. So it's not as much usually that people aren't getting enough in, is that they're not absorbing the iron they get in, or they're losing blood somewhere, having really heavy periods, internal bleeding. Something's going on where you're losing blood, and that will cause changes in iron levels. So, and the thing is it's not really just iron that's the issue. It is anemia. If you get an iron deficiency anemia, that affects your ability to get oxygen to your cells. Now, when I say oxygen, yeah, the anemia can affect that, but what else can affect that? That can be affected by other types of anemia. There's what are called macrocytic anemias like B12, folate, B6. If you're low in those, you just compromise your dopamine productivity because you changed your oxygen levels. What's another thing to be affected? Circulation. If you have lowered circulation, again, this could be like, hey, my fingers get cold easily. My toes get cold easily. I get fungal growth on all my toes. Inhibiting circulation can be affected by the heart. It can be affected by blood vessels dilating or constricting properly, which ties into what's called nitric oxide. There's quite a few things that go into getting oxygen to our cells, and these have to be working right in order to make this dopa. So gotta have that. All right. So in fact, another, I'm going to mention that here in a second. Okay, so then we transfer, now we got the dopamine here. The dopamine has to go to the cells. So here's another thing that can occur is at the receptor. So when dopamine comes and knocks on the door and says, hey, I'm home, if you're inflamed, if the house is on fire, those receptors can be affected and they won't let dopamine in. So if you have inflammation in your body, active inflammation, this can affect any and all of your neurotransmitters. But in this talk, we're talking about dopamine. So that can affect that. Also, if you have too much dopamine, how would you get too much dopamine? Maybe you're on medication for dopamine. Maybe you are, maybe you do a lot of caffeine or you do a lot of nicotine, you're a smoker. These things can increase dopamine temporarily. That's why usually when people do these things, they need a certain amount initially, but then after a while, I got to have more to get the same effect. I got to have more to get the same effect. And before you know it, they're smoking 2 packs a day to get the same effect because nicotine affects dopamine. So again, if we rise that dopamine up too high, though, it surrounds the cell. There's too much knocking at the door, and the guards at the door are saying, don't open the doors. That'll flood the cell. It'll be a problem. If you flood it more, though, if you do something with really strong dopamine, then you'll squeeze some through the door. And this is why a lot of people will head from certain addictive things into actual drugs. A big thing that stimulates dopamine is cocaine. So if you take cocaine, yeah, you can get right through that doorway and you can really stimulate an increase in dopamine. And then after a while, you just have to have more and more to get the same effect, which of course there's some dangers to that. And then another thing too that falls along that same line is amphetamines. This will also increase dopamine and have, of course, the same effect. So, and these things over time can be destructive to these receptors, destructive to the cells, because you're pushing these dopamine pathways too hard and creating problems there. All right, so then we're at the receptor level. Now we're at the DNA level. What can happen at your DNA level that can create a problem here? Well, if you have some genetic issues, if you have genetic SNPs, what does that mean? You've heard of maybe like MTHFR. Well, MTHFR it will play a part in this. It would play a part up here in this folate issue. I'm just talking about MTHFR because that's a gene that everybody's heard about. It's been kind of a buzzword for a while. It affects your ability to methylate folate, to activate folate so your body can use it. So again, if you have an MTHFR issue, yeah, you can have a problem with dopamine. But when we get to the cellular level, there's 2 pretty important genes called COMT and MAO. And again, if these genes are having problems, then at the DNA level, you're not able to manufacture dopamine as well. Now, what can help with that? Big one here is actually a big one that we found that helps along this pathway is that B6, that P5P, which is the activated form. So I find that overcomes this. Now, also, what can affect those genes really the most? Toxic things, heavy metals, chemicals. These things really affect genetic function, because you could have a gene that is a potential problem. Genes, let's put it this way, genes are a tendency. They are not your destiny. It doesn't mean just because you have this genetic issue that you're going to have a problem. You have a higher tendency. Things can easily affect you. Stress, toxins, chemicals, they're going to cause those genes to have problems more than maybe someone else who doesn't have this type of genetic SNP. So again, we've got to look at it from that perspective. Now, one other thing that kind of fits into this too, in fact, I think I want to put that in this other section here. Let's go down here, because another thing that affects dopamine production is progesterone and testosterone. All right. So if you have progesterone issues, if you have testosterone issues, this can affect your ability to make dopamine. And this is sometimes why, let's say, women premenstrually, so right before your period starts, both estrogen and progesterone drop. And let's say you already have an issue. Let's say they drop too low. Let's say you have a hormonal issue, you're inflamed, or something's going on somewhere in your body, your hypothalamus, something's not triggering right that's causing a hormonal issue already, and they drop too low. So if they drop too low, what happens? Your dopamine levels drop too. Your production can drop. And especially during that time when you need this normal production that was going on before you were getting ready to start your period. And then sometimes during the period too, it can stay low. And it's like, gosh, every time I have my period, I feel depressed. I feel lousy. I get all these low dopamine symptoms. So again, this can be an issue due to progesterone or testosterone, especially testosterone in men. This will have an effect too. Lowered testosterone, lowered dopamine levels. So we've got to always keep those perspectives. And a big one, again, that can affect a lot of this is medications. Medications affect along a lot of these lines that we kind of talked about, especially the liver, or if you're taking acids that are affecting it right at the stomach level, the original with the protein. And just along these lines, there's medications can affect many things. So now also on the medication side, there are things that are used to try to help out with dopamine, because if you complain of depression, they'll have dopamine antagonists and dopamine agonists. And these are different types of medications that do different things. One of them is going to be geared more to people who have too much dopamine. If you have too much dopamine, could this cause a psychotic type person? Absolutely. If you have not enough dopamine, you have more of the symptoms we've described, and they'll use a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And what that does is remember, when neurotransmitters, let's say these are two parts of the neuron here, these nerve cells with these axons, and between these receptors where dopamine floats around to stimulate, this dopamine that's in here, again, it's released, it sets in this little gap for a little bit. Little bit means microseconds. I mean, it's just there and it's gone. So what do these medications do? They keep it in the gap longer. They keep this, so again, it has more of an effect, hopefully. But again, if you can't manufacture it in the first place, you're going to have problems, because if you take these medications, they're expecting that you already can produce dopamine to a degree. And what's going to happen is once you're on these meds, they might work for a while because you're producing a certain amount of dopamine. But after a while, it's like, gosh, it didn't work as good as when I first started taking it. And then they will up the dose. So then you'll be on a new dose. Oh, yeah, I'm better. And then after a while, back to square one. Oh, you're up the dose again. Or if you can't up the dose any higher because it's too dangerous, change the medication to a different medication. And this is kind of the road that people get on and just go down, and it's the search for the next medication that's going to help them feel better emotionally. But again, with all of this, we have to look at the cause. We've got to look at those areas of potential malfunction and see if they're existing in a patient to find out, is this what is affecting your dopamine production? Because if we don't find out what it is, and we don't, you're just going to deal with a chronic symptom and just be labeled as, hey, you're a depressed person or you're a low motivated person. Some people say, oh, I'm just born that way. I'm just low motivation, or I'm born that. Well, you may have some genes that give you a tendency towards that, but can you be helped? Big possibility. So again, with a lot of those symptoms we talked about. So I hope this information helped out as far as dopamine issues, and we'll talk more about neurotransmitters in other videos. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I would ask that you definitely try to share this information with others on YouTube, Facebook. Also, give us the thumbs up, like us, do the heart or whatever, and don't hesitate to comment or ask questions. I really appreciate everybody watching. God bless. And I saw on here, hi Miriam, hi Jeannie. Good to see you. Hope you enjoyed today, and I will talk to everybody soon. Have a wonderful day.